Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval paleography, in particular the Post-Carolingian scripts. As a survivor of paleographical examinations at university back in the day, really the most austic discipline that I've ever met, not because apparently had a bad eye for reading, on the contrary, I apparently was even sharper than the average, but that I found extremely boring. In at least the part of, it's actually a very interesting subject, of memorization of all the modern scholarly names given to this or that sign in the way this or that letter was written at a particular point in the Middle Ages in different scripts. One of my earliest videos on Schwerpunkt as a post-traumatic response to the events was dedicated to paleography, but it's, again, actually, together with codicology, a beautiful subject. Never really studied diplomatic, as a matter of fact, but I count to expand on this as well. The world of medieval scripts is quite fascinating. Most of the things you may see by accident about it today, some TikTok showing people writing in the original scripts in a sort of calligraphical fashion. However, it's actually a necessary tool for especially those who venture into archival research, and especially for the earlier Middle Ages, if anything, because in later medieval times, depending on where you are, in say what you're studying, Europe, times and place, but things become much easier. All right, the script way before the printing was essentially pretty standardized. Think about Gothic as a process. It was known as littera moderna at the time, as a matter of fact, as part of the standardization of knowledge in the age of scholastics or of Thomism, and so on. Today we talk about a seminal phase in the history of Europe that you can find more information on in the playlist titled Second Invasions. This will probably not get there, but it's chronologically speaking at the same time. That is to say, the dreadful moment, albeit probably overly dramatized in terms of actual damage inflicted to post-Carolingian Europe, in which Normans, Magyars, Saracens often came to target the most exposed monastic institutions in Europe, right? Because they were rich, they had a lot of treasures, including the same books that probably weren't exactly the main object of looting, even though they cost a lot. It could surely be, there surely was, I never really read anything about that in particular, but surely they could be, if not destroyed, surely sold on some market. It was mostly about the paraphernalia in precious metals that really attracted, together with the broader resources of monasteries as they were rising as veritable lords of the land, lordships of the land in post-Carolingian Europe, that the so-called second invaders began to target. This moment witnesses, as I explained in other videos, actually a triumph of European culture. Because in spite of all these issues that were mostly triggered by internal, say, reasons in Europe, right, rather than any kind of external power capable of fundamentally shattering the foundations of Latin Germanic civilization, monasteries largely acted, not only, as we'll see, also cathedral chapters, abbeys, and so on. I also recently made a video about some monastic centers. We will make more of that to see the width of this. Even before the 11th to 12th century was probably the moment of greatest booming. The connective fabric of post-Carolingian Europe at all sort of social, cultural levels, and especially in the field of properly of manuscript preservation, of knowledge, of wisdom, history, just an identity at a deeper level. We can't stress this enough. I'm looking forward to making more videos on this topic. We are essentially after the latter half of the 9th century, when at least the political framework of the Carolingian Empire had collapsed. This event naturally deeply affected those who lived through it. It was actually a pretty serious moment because, if anything, even though this was, as we've seen, a healthy, say, at least a pretty courageous civilization, going through, in fact, now some sort of sickness, but being able to recover from within the same 10th century. We've seen it also through the reflections of Otto of Cluny, the new congregations that started from these monasteries. The outcomes of this crisis influenced still our perspective of the Middle Ages even too much as a sort of dark period, aside from probably the earlier centuries during and after the migration era. So much so that the 10th century is still called the Iron Century in historiography, or at least it became more famous because of that. This what I will be discussing today is essentially how the specific topic under discussion here, namely the European scripts, were not significantly impacted by this phenomenon, by this crisis. If anything, let's say the disgregation of the Carolingian political framework did even help in part the spread of monasteries. Maybe a controversial statement, but as you know, everything was being rebuilt from the bottom up. Or at least there were quite powerful institutions, including the monastic ones all across Europe, that were surely one of, if not probably the best element of the Carolingian legacy, that you can observe, in fact, also in the survival of its script, right? We will not here remind all the Carolingian ecclesiastical reforms that, in fact, enforced higher standards of uniformity and reliability in scripture at all levels, from the content, philological, properly the way manuscripts were written. A moment of European unity to which the greatest minds of Europe had really participated, even beyond the Carolingian Empire, right? Even Visigoths, what was left of them, at least Anglo-Saxons, and everybody, like from Eastern France to the Longobards, they all found themselves at the court of Charlemagne. That, with the enormous energy that characterized him, that identified him, managed to give this foundation, informing a single unitary script in the West, which is essentially the same ones that we use today. In turn, directly deriving from the Roman script, and especially the late antique one. We will see this better in other videos, but those, again, that are familiar with paleography know what I'm talking about. In fact, even after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, and not even of the empire, because as you know that continued, not even with a fracture, the script remained the dominant writing system across the territories of the former empire. This had not been the case before the Carolingian times, when Europeans largely all wrote in with different scripts, surely all stemming from the late antique Roman one, but taking on the specific regional characteristics that fundamentally rendered them unreadable. And that's why my post-traumatic stress disorder reemerges regarding the difficulties in reading and identifying, especially early, in fact, pre-Carolingian scripts, early medieval scripts. You have the Merovingian, you have the Insular, you have the Visigothic scripts, etc., that are sort of complicated to decipher, especially because there wasn't much uniformity even within this individual regional abode, right? Different authors, different institutions had, again, something that was similar across, by some standard across all Western Europe, but for the Latin script, obviously, but that could wildly vary because of the lack of an overarching imperial authority could inform further uniformity and standards. The post-Carolingian written standards also set apart the Latin Germanic civilization from other political cultural regions, already identifying it as the most advanced. As a matter of fact, I will not open a parenthesis for the Byzantines. Even my apparently natural eye for reading, deciphering properly medieval script didn't extend to Greek paleography. That is another thing. It requires its own specific competence. But if you have an idea of the fact that the Franco-Roman civilization de facto took over 3/4 of Europe, leaving a meager 1/4, not even, of Byzantine world, essentially a Byzantine Orthodox world, also with the spread of some script derived from mostly at some point the Visigothic, and in fact as a hybrid with the Greek script rather than properly, instead of a Latin one mutuated from classical antiquity, like in the case of the West. You have a pretty graphic understanding of the fact that not just the West was already the most extraordinarily culturally interconnected system, and also by far the one that produced the most in terms of actual manuscript tradition, but that also most of Europe simply didn't have a script because they were still largely illiterate, and again, except for the Byzantines in practice. If you're interested in this, I have a playlist about the evangelization of Europe. This video is not going to go there either, but just for reminding you that basically I covered by this point such an enormous amount of topics that you can find a connection across all of them. Interestingly enough, there were also some still Western areas that, while influenced by the Carolingian script, were culturally advanced enough to maintain a relatively distinctive script. In southern Italy, for example, a distinctive script known as the Beneventan was gradually developing unique traits. This is quite interesting. These are the southern Longobards, the Langobardia Minor, all right? That was, of course, a Latinate world, because, again, the notion that there is always this thing that southern Italy was heavily influenced by the Byzantines, by the Greeks. But as a matter of fact, the hinterland was Latin and was also remaining that, even in those areas controlled by the Byzantines. This was not the case because Benevent, the Duchy of Beneventan, here the original Duchy then Principality split eventually with Capua, with Salerno, etc., but maintained, paleographically speaking, the so-called Beneventan script that is characterized, or recalling that, by its angular letter forms and distinctive abbreviations, and that was extensively used, in fact, in Dutch of Benevent. There are beautiful examples, the most magnificent, also because of the illumination sometimes, rendering also pretty graphically accurate idea of what the southern Longobard knights of the 10th, 11th century looked like before the Norman conquest. Can be found in manuscripts such as the Codex Vaticanus Latinus 4939. This is a 10th century lectionary from this southern European region. All right, and it is interesting that this state, it was basically in between, literally, the Carolingian Empire, plus the Western Empire later on, and the Byzantine Empire was alternatively, was mostly subjected to the Frankish part. At times was never fully controlled again until the Normans came into the scene. Yet it was particularly advanced, even though most of its influences were, say, mostly internal. Say they derived actually from a wider space, or it maintained its own characteristic. And again, this territory, despite being continental and rocked in southern Italian mountains, still was pretty vivacious and providing us with this magnificent paleographical evidence. The Codex Vaticanus Latinus 4939, by the way, contains liturgical readings and Beneventan names for chant notation, exemplifying the script's use in religious context, particularly in the area around Salerno and Capua. The script likely became standardized in Benevent during the 10th century. It was similar to the Western one in general. It was influenced by that, but it still developed in its own peculiar way and achieved its characteristic form in the 11th century within the scriptorium of the renowned Monte Cassino Abbey, one of the most influential and celebrated centers in Christendom, as I explained also in the recent video about the selection of medieval monasteries. It's important to actually specify there are even sub branches of the script, right? A more Apulian one on the Adriatic, some more also internal one. Monte Cassino is at least very close to Rome. Then in the far southern part of the duchies, there was all some different characteristics that you can actually identify through paleographical study that is also relatively statistical, like how often does a particular trait recur, a particular type of abbreviation. This is all blended, by the way, with the codicology, so the study of the manuscript as an archaeological object, which also underscores some specific characteristics in the making of these manuscripts. By the way, costs a lot, as we were saying before. If you call the poor ship's loader in order to get this, but it was really like having, I don't know, a Ferrari, but at the time, like in just having in this monastic libraries, even, I don't know, 60, 70 manuscripts was like a wow moment. Likewise, Christian Spain, that we also recently observed the rise of Navarre, was gradually coalescing around this, in fact, small kingdoms in the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula, and steadily reclaiming larger territories from Islamic invaders, operating outside, largely at least outside the realm of Carolingian script that had been and would remain very influential in Spain, but that, however, still cultivated a unique graphic style called, in fact, the Visigothic. In the Visigothic script, evident in manuscripts like the Codex Vigilianus, completed in 976 at the monastery of San Millán de la Cogolla, that we have also used for our iconographic sources of Iberian milites from the era, is a quite fine example of that. I would invite you, like this is also why I make these videos, to literally pick the name, the numbers of the manuscripts, and go check in them, because they're all standardized. Many of them are, say, in catalogation, and they're also in large part digitalized, and they're just beautiful. Also, just of the illumination. If, like children, you prefer pictures as opposed to other aspects of, say, in fact, layout and script finesse, even though it sort of blends all together aesthetically speaking. The Visigothic featured typically rounded letter forms and was used at this point in the kingdoms of Leon and Castile, that were still separated, reflecting a distinct scribal tradition rooted in earlier Iberian practices. Consider that the Iberian Peninsula is very enshrined within itself in cultural matters. We've seen it at many other political, military, social levels, and compared to other countries in Western Europe, and especially this early on, especially in this quite rough mountaineer cultures of the north, maintains even those sort of early medieval suggestions and did not really participate too much to the peaks of the Carolingian Enlightenment / Renaissance, whatever you want to call it. The Codex Vigilianus is also known as the Codex Albeldensis. It includes a collection of Visigothic laws and chronicles showcasing the script's role in legal and historical documentation in the Kingdom of Leon. That was like this other northern Iberian realms, mostly very much founded on dynastic or at least royal principles, and their conquest is very ideological since the beginning. So there are very interesting historiographical and politological suggestions coming from these areas, including Imperial ones. I have a dear friend, colleague of mine that published about this stuff in particular, specializing in it. Also, I will not give other details, but there are comparisons between Spain and England. Now, the sharp decline in written documentation from the 10th century compared to the Carolingian period is debatable. It, first of all, should never lead us to assume that the decline of certain monasteries when they were targeted by the second invaders had anything to do with the actual state of education of the entire Latin Germanic continent, nor with the quality of written production. Europe was actually booming. The 10th century is the moment in which probably what we call like the 1000, the rebirth of year 1000 actually started. Around the year 1000, we mostly start being able to document the results of what this process. Culture, production, development, etc. never went back even remotely to the levels of the 6th and the 7th centuries that had been the toughest in the world during the Middle Ages. Rather than the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire, the primary causes of some regional 10th century's regional documentary desert were the aforementioned invasions by the Normans, the Hungarians, and the Saracens, along with the resulting destruction. As we explained, monasteries were rich, fat, often unprotected, even though they often were well built and would, in fact, resist to these marauders that were also not just stopping at every single place to besiege it, to starve it out. In fact, we should point out that a monastic life was also consistently much safer, even in this time, the one of the militas out there. And you can see it even just from the age of certain authors, like the men fighting out there did not often make it, even just out of their own exertions, as machines, as war machines, as long as this wise men dedicated to contemplative life mostly, and to culture. It's also a myth that monks did not move. Remember that the monastic ideal, especially in the West, was always connected with the world. While eremitic experiences existed, the purpose of the monasteries was the one of properly being shown to the rest of the world. The idea was from the monastery itself as a projection of the heavenly Jerusalem, to convince the rest of the world to live in the same way. And actually, even during this 10th century, monks traveled a freaking lot, mostly from monastery to monastery, aside from also other interesting lay functions, such as diplomats, counselors, and just even pilgrims and more. We'll talk more about this aspect. Besides, there were lots of laymen working in the monasteries. Just think about all these illuminators. Many were monks themselves, but we know that especially in the richest, more monetized areas, there were lots of laymen that regularly worked for the monastery, even just for other meal functions. Notable examples of destructions include some of the most important abbeys in history here, namely the aforementioned Monte Cassino, Farfa, both near Rome, the latter in Sabina, and Novalesa in the Susa Valley. Right, in the previous, in the aforementioned video about monastic centers, we talked about Monte Cassino, not Farfa yet, and we've seen how the Abbey of Breme in Lomellina was refounded as, a new center by the refugees of the Novalesa, attacked by the Saracens. This monastic centers had been devastated between the mid-9th and mid-10th centuries and left abandoned even for extended periods. Monte Cassino was sacked by the Saracens in 883. Farfa was abandoned after repeated attacks by Saracens around 890. And Novalesa was destroyed by Islamic raiders in 906. All right. There is all a history also with Albert Maiolus, the Saracens reaching up to the Rhineland across the Alps, and so on. The monks of the Novalesa in particular fled towards Turin. carrying, and we can literally, as paleographically, trace these movements, carrying key manuscripts, like the Codex Novalicensis, right? We have these kind of issues, especially with Islamic invasions. For example, when Spain was conquered by the Muslims, there is a lot of Spanish Christians, a lot of Visigoths that come to Italy, and we find Visigothic codes exactly from that era in Italy, and say, how did they come there? Because up to that point, actually, the two areas were not even particularly aligned with one another. As you know, the Visigoths went a bit on their own, also with the councils of Toledo, did not quite fit the broader Franco-Anglo-Italic axis with Rome as de facto already the spiritually hegemonic metropolitic see of the West. Speaking of the aforementioned Codex Novalicensis, this was a collection of hagiographical and historical texts, later preserved in the National Library of Turin in Piedmont, demonstrating the monks' efforts to safeguard their literary heritage during the crisis. Also because, as we explained, these manuscripts cost a lot, so they were veritable treasures that even these refugees wanted to take with them. For many reasons, there are deep also in spiritual nature. People loved knowledge, right? Remember this, that this is also what the West is. These, because contemplative and active life are traditionally symbiotic, right? You can attain the empire in theory through both ways, but their fusion is the most powerful. And that's why, again, the two universal powers were there, acting also against the external invasions. Now, these abbeys during the mid 9th centuries had also benefited from the patronage, in fact, of Frankish rulers, kings and emperors alike, and served as vital hubs for the creation and preservation of written texts. It was very important, especially already during the Carolingian Empire, to stiffen the ecclesiastical, the monastic net. We've seen royal abbeys properly treated as almost public domain, with also extra privileges and immunities. In the Frankish attempt to establish a state, especially north of the Alps, drawing a lot especially from Italy, in that sort of administrative, centralized models of Roman papal legacy and inspiration. And in great part, this system actually survived the same empire. That's what we were saying before. The episcopal, the monastic net survived Carolingian Empire pretty darn well, and greatly helped the reconstitution also of lay authority at a universal scale. Nevertheless, the literary output of the latter half of the 10th century, though poorly represented in surviving manuscripts, with most of the period's renowned literary and historiographical works preserved in no more than 5 manuscripts, and famous texts by figures like Liutprand of Cremona or Roswitha of Gandersheim, known only through early modern printed editions, exhibits exceptional quality in both form and content, meaning that the manuscripts were actually written at the time were excellent. You know that especially during the Ottonian times, which, Liutprand and Roswitha belong, there was a further refinement. This would further, because essentially of the further elite nature of monastic centers, and if you look at Liutprand and Roswitha themselves, they were people of immense culture, because also the monastic foundations that supported them were ever richer, prolific. Besides, there was a Byzantine influence, as you know, in tastes, especially at the time of Otto II, Otto III, and especially a great also ideological insistence on the Romanity, properly of the golden era, the Renovatio Imperii, right, that transpires through the beautiful illuminated manuscripts of the Ottonian court and beyond. The historical writings of the Longobard Liutprand, who notoriously served as an imperial ambassador to Constantinople multiple times and, in fact, worked at the court of Otto I, through whose support he secured the bishopric of Cremona, one of the most important episcopal sees in the Po Valley. I also made a video about medieval Cremona if you're interested. And we talk about Liutprand in general, made lots of videos about the Ottonians. Stands as perhaps the most prominent and vivid examples of an author's linguistic mastery, creative talent, and imagination. Very, very cultured people, versed in history, and this also stems not from a wasteland. I mean, say Ottonian Italy, we made videos about that, central northern Italy in particular, like the Saracen incursions, the Magyar ones are over by this point. So these areas had, as you know, maintained their own peculiarly highly civilized, urbanized, literate, rich cultural profile, and also, and especially thanks to episcopal centers, producing an enormous amount of cultural output. Right, this is where probably universities, the communes would spread in a couple of centuries, and we're already basically that from the pretty tidy public culture that the Longobards kingdom had consolidated also throughout the Carolingian, post-Carolingian period. Liutprand's Antipodesis, written between 958 and 962, and his Historia Ottonis, composed around 965, provide detailed accounts of Otto I's court and Byzantine diplomacy, preserved primarily in a single manuscript, that is the Codex Monachensis 6388. The Antipodesis includes a detailed account of Liutprand's embassy to Constantinople in 960, describing the opulence of the Constantinopolitan court and the diplomatic exchanges with Emperor Constantine VII. Liutprand expressed himself in Latin with apparent ease, seemingly unhindered by the challenges often associated with using a non-native language, because at this point, Liutprand, that identified as a Longbard, and actually as a Germanic in this sense, was actually an Italian. He spoke Romance as his first language, but obviously had a great education and culture that allowed him to write, in fact, one of the most impressive histories of the year, and being able, in fact, to show off his Latin in the Byzantine Empire. The expressive capabilities of 10th century writers must be assessed in the context of their everyday linguistic experiences as well. During the same period and in the same region, a contemporary of Liutprand of Cremona, the erudite, yet another highly cultured individual, Gunz of Novara, as is in today's Piedmont, at the time would be Lombardy historically meant. If you're interested, I have a video about medieval Lombardy that explains a bit the question. Emphasized the challenges faced by a 10th century resident of northern Italy in mastering Latin correctly. And this is very interesting because we often talked about humanism and how Latin was sort of interpreted at that point. There are very interesting philosophical and philological, linguistic, and cultural reflections on this. While an Italian vernacular already existed, and it hadn't made it in fact, as a literary language yet, because it was so similar to Latin, after all, that there was no problem. Like, for example, in France, there still was a Romance country, by the way, and more obviously in Germany, that had, in this sense, this early Old French, Old German in written form, right? As a fully fledged literature. Think about the Odes of Strasbourg, as a matter of fact. In Italy, the matter was different. And the most cultured people that wrote mastered Latin, but it's not like they could speak it. All right, this was passed from a while. However, so they could actually speak it if properly educated. In fact, it's being pointed out how it's only in the 15th century that Latin dies as a spoken language, because at that point, at least the European really scholarly elite could speak out. Don't think, by the way, that in the Middle Ages it was so easy, for example, even for the clergy to simply speak Latin, understanding one another across Europe, but in a spoken fashion, right? That's why also the written one was crucial. And it's different. For example, I know Latin pretty well, but I can't speak it. I can, but say I simply haven't been trained in that. So that was the case for the Middle Ages as well. It was the most straightforward way of communicating across Europe, but not quite in a spoken fashion. That was, however, required to some extent. I mean, especially in these earlier times, the clergy would have pushed towards this international, in fact, lingua franca, to be mastered by its members, especially after post-Carolingian reforms. Gunzo, in his Epistola ad Augenses, dated to roughly 965, explicitly criticized the grammatical errors of the monks at Reichenau, that, by the way, was one of the most highly cultured and educated monastic communities in Germany, where also probably the concept of the Teutonic identity was developed together at St. Gall, near what would become Switzerland, but also the Abbey of Fulda that I discussed in the aforementioned video about the 10 monastic centers. This is interesting because it's basically an Italian saying, you can't speak Latin, not of the Alps, you can't write it well, even as clergymen. It was a thing. We know that the Carolingian reform stemmed from pretty abysmal standards, like in Bavaria, like leading to priests reading in Latin, but really not understanding what that meant and causing some terrible, let's say, misconceptions, even just doctrinally, that fortunately didn't have any capacity to spread further because nobody really understood much of that. There was no theological cultural premise for some some sort of conceptions gone wrong. But this highlights the complexities of Latin education in a region where Romance vernaculars were emerging at this point. In fact, while vernacular existed at this point, it was not yet fully in a spoken fashion. That at some point that straightforwardly separated from Latin, that also had its own transformations over the centuries, by the way. If anything, we'll talk about this at some point, some good history of linguistic history of Romance languages in the High Middle Ages, and it's very interesting philologically and not only. This can be observed, for example, in the earliest vernacular glosses in Italian manuscripts, like the Codex Vercellensis 183. This codex is a 9th century gospel book containing marginal glosses, which are actually the most straightforward sources of vernacular, because the texts would have actually been written in proper Latin, but the glosses were used as, in fact, annotations, as also some divagations of some sort of exercises, etc. At this point, in an early form of Old Italian, dated to, in fact, the same period, 960, marking one of the earliest examples of vernacular writing in Italy. Consider that the culture of the era was heavily dominated by mnemonic training, right? Since, as we've seen, manuscript, properly the codices, cost so much, it was incredibly convenient and easy if you had been trained from since you were little in memorizing. Was by far one of the most convenient ways to be expandable, even just as a man of culture for whichever educational or administrative office, also within the monastic and the diocesan communities. All right, but if you really study your entire life, and again, you have to memorize also not such a small amount of written culture. I mean, some people in Middle Ages knew the Bible by heart. Try to do it now yourself. But it also comes easy, right? Your brain is trained. It's much actually more feasible than today you would think because of your laziness. The language's similarity to the commonly spoken vernacular made it naturally difficult to avoid what we term linguistic interference of some sort. This observation, as one can readily appreciate, is immensely valuable for those studying the interplay between Latin and the vernacular, as well as between orality and writing in such distant eras. As at some point, these people were bilingual, if they knew Latin pretty well, but they de facto spoke in vernacular. Again, a proper Italian literature was starting at this point in some ways, but in a more fully fledged way, but the 12th century. Now, the challenges faced by authors like Hroswitha of Gandersheim or Widukind of Corbeil, and made a video about him. He was biographer of Otto the Great, and having lots of opinions in that sense regarding national identities in the empire. And together with Hroswitha, who came from aristocratic Saxon families in a region Christianized for less than a century and a half, when they were educated in their respective monastic schools, were likely quite different, right? Hroswitha's works, as you know, very spiritual, including her 6 dramas modeled on Terence, the Roman author, were composed around the same period here we were talking about before 965 and 970 at the Gandersheim Abbey, a very important center, and preserved in the Codex Emeramensis from St. Emeram. You understand also from this classification is the number of the catalog of a specific monastery. All right, while Widukind's Res Geste Saxonice, written around 967-979 at Corbeil, survives in 3 manuscripts, such as the Codex Dresdensis, DC 183. Saxony was interestingly developing in this monastic centers of culture together with the court Magdeburg and other centers. So all these men had, women had some significant subsidies to pursue some the highest studies of the time. Hroswitha's drama Dulcitius, one of her 6 plays, portrays the martyrdom of 3 Christian virgins, blending classical form with Christian themes. This theme was quite relevant at the time because of the heathen enemies of the empire, the same Norse, the Magyars in particular in Germany, as we will see better now also in Widukind, but also in Mediterranean. For example, the Ottonians were maintaining some pretty intense diplomatic relations with the Caliphate of Cordoba, also to clear some final Saracen presence from southern Italy, from southern France. And there, we've seen in a recent video, I don't remember which one, it was anecdotal, but still, like the figure of Pelagius of the Asturias, who was martyrized in Cordoba, and there are all themes here being developed regarding say the ancient martyrdom, but reported to the local, to the contemporary times, which was also kind of fitting. I mean, there were missionaries across Central Europe, especially close to Saxon, the northeast, toward the Baltic, were being martyrized still, and there was a significant threat still of, in some cases, of destabilization of at least the more the outer avamposts. For this reason, Widukind's work, for example, includes a detailed account of the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, a decisive victory of Otto I against the Magyars that, as you know, finally settled down, Christianized in a few generations. They stopped, most importantly, the raids against the West. I recently, last spring, made a video about the Battle of Riade, 933, where Otto's father, Henry the Fowler, had already dealt a pretty heavy blow to the Magyars. In the same central Germany, and so the times where these heathens were troublesome for even what would become the Imperial dynasty were close, and there was all a sense also of local devotion, folklore, identity, sense of themselves connected with the struggle. It had been a successful one because, as we explained, at this point, Franco-Roman civilization was overwhelming all these boundaries and winning by far, also against the Greek Orthodox attempts at evangelization, in fact, would succeed only with marginal peoples in the bigger picture. The fact that Roswitha, a canoness, ventured to write poetic works aiming to offer her audience a Christian alternative to the comedies of Terence, that naturally at the time was not Christian, and writing in that lens, which were highly popular, by the way, at the Saxon court, nevertheless, because, again, there was an important classical education also in this course of Northern Europe, or that Widukind tackled the formidable task of chronicling his Saxon people's history from their mythical origins, reviving a storied tradition last exemplified by Paul the Deacon for the Longobards at the end of the 8th, beginning of the 9th century, the time of Charlemagne, evokes profound admiration, right? If you're interested in Eastern Frankish Christian literature, especially from the 9th century, the Eliand, the Muspili, the Ludwigslied, I made an entire video about that, as well as the extraordinary success of the Carolingian evangelization of Saxony. I will have to talk more about Saxon and also Old Saxon history, pre-Christian Saxon history. The largely Germanic and predominantly illiterate environment, however, in which the northernmost Christian peoples lived, would seem wholly unconducive to such sophisticated literary endeavors, and instead, the Saxons incarnated, exactly as we just said, that dramatic Franco-Roman success in elevating this people was the most apparently unreceptive, underdeveloped, brutal, sort of anti-Carolingian, that anti-imperial, anti-universal. I explained also in a bit about probably the German Imperial Catholic miracle instead, the proof that these peoples were fully ready for civilization. And in the case of the Saxons, probably to wield the Imperium to an incredibly successful degree. The mix of this primal military forces, brutally disciplined, tamed, in this sense ordered and efficientated, so to say, by the Carolingians, and in fact this aspect of a unitary, universal control blessed by the clergy, the Church of Rome, the more contemplative side, as we've seen also these authors, would spur, say, the Saxon militants to the recompaction of the empire, the Renovatio Imperii, in particular the hinging of the Eastern Frankish kingdom with the Italic one, that would essentially form this major axis of the Holy Roman Empire. Which also shows, by the way, that if these peoples would have allegedly, some would like to imagine, being done some such wrongdoing by the conquest, evangelization, were in some ways very brutal, in positive things, there's no doubt, is that these peoples did not go back to any of that. On the contrary, they fully understood all the advantage of the world. Surely this happened with a different social-cultural pattern that sort of brought the majority of people down. It's not like they were particularly elevated already before. The elites were already in charge. The aristocracy took the chance. There is also the Stellinger revolt. There are chances, right, to test the viability of this system. And especially against the Magyars, the Slavs that accompanied them, made multiple videos about the eastern frontier of the empire. We realized that the Saxon triumph equated to already like a remarkably advanced European civilization in the West. Right, the Latin Germanic world was really already ready, in fact, to a significant sprint forward. The undeniable formal excellence of 10th century literary production in the West underscores the continued effectiveness of surviving monastic schools, importantly enough, which were increasingly supplemented, as we explained, patronized and funded as cultural centers by institutions established at, say, also cathedral churches. There wasn't just the lay authority doing so, but again, if you look at the bishop counts of Italy, in the local, say, Italic dioceses, where figures like Liutprand and Gudzo, as we've seen, were likely trained. You understand the degree of culture and education that they could achieve, even compared to the Byzantines, for example. The cathedral school of Cremona, where Liutprand was educated, emerged as a key center by the mid-10th century, while Novara's cathedral school associated with Gunzo produced charters and theological texts, as evidenced by the surviving Codex Novariensis II. This codex, a 10th century collection of patristic texts and sermons, reflects the school's role in preserving theological scholarship in northern Italy. Yet, the fragmentation of political structures undeniably restricted at this point the circulation of such works at a time, which typically remained confined to a single kingdom emerging from the ruins of Carolingian unity. It was not a few, meaning if you really look at, for example, the Cluniac congregation, and made a video about Odo Cluny, the general spirits of the time, why is that these congregations were born, also in terms of reformed and uniformed unity rule. It was still Saint Benedict's, but with this sort of greater kick, even towards, in this case, given that it was mostly meant by monks coming from oligarchic families, right? They could take a great elite knowledge and culture. Ever more books were being stored and starting to circulate. It is true that this is still an era where mostly Europe reasons by regional boundaries. With a case, actually, of Italy and Germany that we just stressed, there is a significant, this may be the only case of specific interconnection, together also with the opening to the Mediterranean, also the Byzantine context, as we've seen. So there is a lot of influence that Theophanes Corredum, after her marriage with Otto II, brings lots of probably Byzantine stuff, also material objects, to the Saxon court, and it is a big deal. Otto III could truly feel himself like a Roman emperor, like of German and Greek blood, ruling from the Palatinum hill in Rome at some point. That sense of universal vibe in terms also of sort of unitary knowledge, incarnated towards the end of the century by Gerberto of Aurillac, the famous later Pope Sylvester II, that was incredibly cultured from his Alvernian background, very versed also in science and mathematics, etc., due also to the proximity with the Islamic world, which, contrary to general depiction, was not really osmotically providing Europeans with stuff. It was just Christians actually going over to places like Toledo and picking manuscripts. And this is, importantly enough, what especially will start more intensely to happen from the 11th century. It's not like that world was more advanced and the West was just exposed to that and began to grow. It was already growing by itself, and much more than the Arabs and Byzantines. And it's the same Westerners that go pick manuscripts that those guys were also barely reading, especially compared to the way the Westerners did, which was much more intense and widespread and relying also on these monastic and cathedral foundations. It's incredibly important to understand how intellectually advanced the West already was. It's a major chapter in European history that has been in part hidden also for ideological reasons. The overstatement, in a sense, of the so-called Golden Age of Islam that surely did exist, by the way, and I will make more videos explaining it, how, but that when you look at it's a bit the difference between quantity and quality. And when you look at the size of the Latin Germanic West, it's not even a matter of quantity, like it's something comparable already, but already the West had maintained a more widespread, critical, and productive, intellectually thriving approach scattered across this major region compared to what happened in other societies that mostly inherited an Hellenistic sense of knowledge, mostly enormous libraries filled with manuscripts that, however, just a few court literates really read and used for broader scientific literary purpose. This is very important to stress. all right? It's not like the Byzantines or the Arabs were particularly behind the West. No, they had literacy, they had, again, wealth, they had education, but when you actually look more closely at this, also in specifically political ways and the access to this kind of knowledge, you realize that the West was not bad put at all, right? And that there is also West and West, right? But even in the far northwest of Europe, you do find a pretty early monastic literacy, production, etc., in ways that you can't actually see in the East, the way it was going on. And again, for different reasons that I will come to discuss it again, because these were some of the oldest themes, the older videos of Schwerpunkt, and then we didn't necessarily follow up to that in the last years. The scope of information in historiographical works also reflects these horizons. Yes, there was a contraction from the mid-9th century. The annals, a historiographical form organized strictly chronologically speaking, the most common, produced in major Frankish abbeys, indicate that at this period that historians relied on sources from during the peak of the second invasions from increasingly limited regions. In other words, they didn't travel too much in the moment. But there were also many internal reasons. There were regions that were still fundamentally in contact with one another and also sharing sources uninterruptedly. The Annals of Fulda, compiled until 901, and the Annals of Saint-Bertin, ending around 882, show some decline in cross-regional information, with Fulda's record silent on Western events. After all, also the two kingdoms had separated, and Saint-Bertin unaware of Eastern raids as well, right, from Western France. This is, of course, fascinating. We will talk more about how even politics just favored this divide, because it's not like these regions, as we've seen, were separated from the rest. There was also a great deal of north-south axis, still connection going on. The Annals of Fulda recorded the death of Emperor Arnulf in 899, but omit any mention of Norman activities in the west, for example, while the Annals of Saint-Bertin detailed the Viking siege of Paris in 885-886, but lack information on eastern frontier issues with the Magyars, even though the Hungars will come to raid as far as northeastern France. This is also kind of obvious to some extent, given that the some details would have also been less relevant. There were so many attacks; it wasn't always or necessarily a matter of interest. Like if some of the smaller ones that weren't even too frequent in the same place. There were some places were raided thrice in all during the I don't know, this 200 years, which was a lot for the time. Don't get me wrong, but at the same time did not really end up anywhere. And still, again, the political priorities of this kingdom is mostly concentrated within themselves. In Fulda, located in central Germany, there was no awareness of the Norman raids ravaging the kingdom of Charles the Bald, at least sticking to its annals, which doesn't mean that in essence they quite didn't know what was going on. But this mirrors, of course, what was happening in Saint-Bertin in eastern France, where little nor information was available about the Magyars, so the Slavic incursions along the Christendom eastern borders. There was a certain rivalry between the Western and Eastern Franks. Let's not forget that at some point, especially during the late Carolingian era, these kingdoms had thrown Vikings at each other throughout the process. It's not like, again, all these kingdoms did not share literally everything. The Norse, the Magyars, the Saracens, all raided all three the main post-Carolingian kingdoms. All right. So, at large, there was an awareness of what was going on, but obviously, today we will not look at these annals in particular, but there were specific interests, like objects of discussion, of interest, that did not necessarily have to take into account everything that was happening in the neighboring countries. By the late 9th century, the practice of annalistic writing itself waned because some greater imperial unity was also over, and local kings were not so effective, especially compared to provincial powers. And when it resumed, its informational foundation was even more restricted. For example, in 10th century Lotharingia, spanning modern borderlands of France and Germany, Benelux, monks and clerics in cathedral churches were often unaware even of the names of Roman popes, which is fascinating because Lotharingia, admittedly, this was not really true. I made a video about Charles III, or better, about Rome in the age of Charles III. And we know pretty well how direct, consistent, and axiomatic, for example, the Western and Eastern Frankish struggles in Rome were, right? How the local factions backed different figures, profiles. This would continue at some point. Lotharingia was a bit really suspensed in the midst of, not really nowhere, but of itself, so to say. So it's a sort of exception to a degree. It was a bit more on its own, so that admittedly was a bit more detached. So you have to balance the two factors. Like, of course, you can't paint a picture of disintegration, of contraction, which is surely what happened in the later Carolingian era, but the idea that there would be some sort of collapse of contacts is not really true. Also because this happened transcontinentally, and just documentation is something. Actual contact, actual knowledge is also something different, right? The fact that we don't have specific works that were eventually treasured in grander style, in historiography, the history of a certain ruler, which were mostly, especially north of the Alps, the main mover, right, the main engine for this literary production, historiographical production. It's the most important genre, literally speaking. Does not mean that there wasn't actual knowledge circulating and important information about the rest of Europe, right? So it all really depends. It's also true that, again, some of these areas had been just recently civilized, colonized, are properly organized in more rational and universal Catholic fashion, but it does not mean that they were disconnected, in fact, from the surroundings. When you look at the Annals of Loches, for example, revived briefly in the 60s of the 10th century, but we don't find references to popes like John the 12th, 955-964. This could happen for different reasons. They already at the time were also connected with maybe a certain attitude of Lotharingia and its scriptoria, not much in isolation, maybe even in contrast with the Ottonians. There had been a previous period, in particular the first half of the 10th century, where you can imagine these places not having had too much contact with the Roman papacy as before, but we know pretty well that the evangelization of Europe was continuing, that the papacy was actually directing that from Rome, as it had happened even in sort of much more difficult times, like in the times of the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. So again, let's be careful to distinguish the documentation from the actual reality. And in fact, we could make lots of examples in this regard. The Annals of Loches, preserved in the Codex Vaticanus Palatinus Latinus 170, include entries of on local ecclesiastical appointments, but lack references to broader papal history, indicating limited external communication or more likely, sort of limited interest in some specific continental dynamics and a certain provincialization of thought. Because we've seen it, I haven't made a video about Lotharingia yet, but it sort of, I think, encapsulates, it's an idea for next video, by the way, that sort of, for example, this place it was not really a kingdom even by this point. It was something sort of quite strange on its own. But if you look at Burgundy, Western Franks, the Eastern Franks, they all had substantial contacts with Rome, right? Nor they had ever wavered at any other point. So why exactly during the 10th century, right? It doesn't hold against scrutiny. But it still serves as a clear indication that historiography depended heavily on the movement of people and the political integration of various regions in general, which alone made such writings both necessary and feasible. In this light, the establishment of a Romano-Christian empire under the Saxon dynasty, or at least the continuation from the Carolingian era, arguably even probably the Roman one, which was actually and is actually the correct way to see this metaphysically and as far as they believed, facilitated a resurgence of exchanges, people, goods, information, and ideas across a vast geographical area extending from the North Sea to Italy, from the Rhine to the Elbe, and into the emerging Slavic territories, were gradually colonized and molded by the Ostsiedlung. Thus, it is just a parenthesis, a gap in documentation, not really any major collapse. People like to emphasize catastrophe in history rather than continuity. It is important, but especially they do it on this material basis and not much on the moral one that still exists. The coronation of Otto I as emperor in 962 in Rome, documented in the Continuatio Regionalis by Adalbert of Magdeburg, marked a pivotal moment in different ways, with diplomatic missions also at that point coordinated between the papacy and the Ottonians, such as those to the Polish Duke Mieszko I in 965. You understand how those years were crucial in all this, fostering cultural and textual exchanges across these regions. Adalbert's chronicle, preserved in the Codex Vaticanus Reginensis Latinus 295, details Otto's diplomatic efforts, including the marriages of Mieszko I to the Czech princess Dubravka in 965. You realize it's exactly all the same years. They're so crucial, which facilitated the Christianization of Poland. All right, I made some videos about that. We'll talk more, especially about we'll talk about both Poland and Bohemia at that point, and we'll have to come back on that. And during this chronological and cultural phase, southern Italy also witnessed for the first time the use of miniatures as a tool of support both written and oral communication. We explained that, especially for the exultet, previously limited to luxury cottages, at least, because there had been illuminations also in the early Middle Ages in the Langobardia Minor. We will see it, if anything, in other videos, and thus accessible at the time to only a select few. Illustrations took on a more modern role in the Beneventan liturgical rolls, known as the rotuli of the exultet, which were particular because basically they were written like to be unrolled from the pulpit, and the illumination was essentially upside down compared to the text, because the priest had to unroll this while reading, and therefore just like at the movies, so to say, the audience of the faithful would watch the various illuminations scrolling down, and so scroll down and enjoying the pictures from their side, from their verse. And this enjoyed enduring popularity. It's very peculiar, again, of southern Italy, of this Longobard hinterland, with the latest examples dating to the Swabian era, and accompanied, as we've seen, also by the Beneventan script that is quite precisely there. Again, we'll use more exultet rolls iconography also for our videos. We'll make at some point on this period, southern Longobard warfare. The earliest surviving exultet roll is from Bari, that was actually largely a Byzantine city, but obviously had, with its italic interland, fits the general picture, and it had Latin script employed. It dates to roughly 981-987. It is now preserved at the Capitolary Archive in Bari, and it contains 11 miniatures depicting scenes like the arrowing of hell, designed to complement the chanted text of the Easter Vigil. Right, so imagine this literally scroll at the time in the 10th century in these churches at night. It's beautiful, right? Another notable exalted roll from Salerno on the Tyrrhenian, around 975, preserved in the Diocesan Museum of Salerno, features 8 miniatures including depictions of the resurrection tailored to enhance the liturgical performance during the Easter Vigil. In this unique type of manuscript, the text tied to the Easter liturgy was written, as we explained, to be read by the officiant from the top of the pulpit, while the miniatures were oriented in the opposite direction to the writing, allowing the congregation gathered at the pulpit's base to view them. Right, and these illustrations served as a visual accompaniment to the text being read and possibly even elaborated upon in the vernacular. So to be a more engaging, educational, and fitting the purpose, right, of reinforcing, as we've seen, also essentially a provincial identity in the Langobardia Minor that will maintain a strikingly sort of, in fact, Longobard background for a very long time, even after the Norman conquest. And if anything, we will have to look at that in other videos. And I'm really glad to discuss these topics because, first of all, I don't think not many people do, as you have understood, even when we look at this ideally technical topics, we are still leading them to some historical interpretation, say, why is it important to learn this stuff? Like, this is not the visually based channel that has to show you, oh, look, this is the script, look at how cool it is, and then telling you nothing about what this was all about. Oh, look, this is something to watch, like, again, with children watching stuff. This is not how we're supposed really to study history. In order to understand the stuff, you must properly get why they were doing it for. Why is it this different from another place? Why did the tradition develop? And tying it to the walls, right? From the detail to the broader picture, and in a general appreciation of this double thread that constantly informs the general outlook of all these productions. Right, so here I was looking at script. Yeah, I haven't made so many videos about the script here. As you understand, it's relatively unspecific. This is not much of a paleographical video per se, but we're adding something overall. And so it seems that someone even watches my medieval literature playlist. And whenever I make these videos, I have continuous ideas regarding what other videos I can make. At this point, it's become really easy, at least in possible conception. We will surely cover many different topics. I see that you're predictably enjoying my video about William Marshall, even though I must say this year, normally in September we skyrocket. We have high point in views, major channel takeoff, and it didn't happen. How or why? A bit at the end of August, but not now. I don't really understand why this is the case. It's as if something changed either in the algorithm or in how you react to my stuff. Share as much as possible. That's the single most important thing. And also realize that, again, we have to go on in quite consistent ways if we really want this to also become something broader and greater. So unfortunately, I don't know what's with YouTube. We should perhaps sponsor the channel more. I have no idea, right? I think it's important for us to mainly be consistent with ourselves. If we like this channel, if you understand its message, well, we should share it as much as possible. And what can I say more? For today, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.